It was a strange pull that led me back to her office that night. The same place where, for months, she had counseled others on intimacy, trust, and fidelity. I had helped her set it up, painting the walls a serene sage green, hanging prints of Klimt and O'Keeffe, all to make her clients feel at ease. Yet tonight, those same walls felt oppressive, watching me like witnesses to my humiliation. I couldn't say what made me check the camera feed. It was something small, her quick goodbye before leaving for work that morning, the faint edge in her tone when I asked if we'd have dinner together. I told myself I wouldn't watch the footage. Installing the cameras had been a low point, one I justified as protective paranoia, though it reeked of desperation. But the moment I opened my laptop and saw the timeline spike, curiosity won out. I pressed play. At first, there was nothing unusual. Her adjusting her skirt, tidying the room before her next client. She had this habit of smoothing her hair, a nervous tick she did without thinking. I had always thought it charming. But then the door opened, and in walked a man I vaguely recognized, a client. The session began with calm professionalism. Her voice, usually so smooth and clinical, took on that nurturing cadence I'd fallen for during our first meeting. She gestured emphatically as she talked, leaning forward, her hands almost brushing his knees. And then, somewhere between the careful crossing of his legs and the slight leaning of her body toward his, something shifted. It was so subtle, so natural, I almost missed it. She laughed. Too warmly, too freely. She leaned closer, and he mirrored her as if they shared a secret language. Her hand, feather-light, touched his arm. Then, like a spring snapping loose, the clinical barrier shattered. I leaned forward, frozen, as her lips met his, softly at first, then hungrily. I expected myself to scream, to throw the laptop against the wall, but my body betrayed me as much as she had. My pulse raced. My hand hovered over the trackpad, poised to stop the video, but I couldn't. It spiraled fast. Her perched on the edge of her desk, his hands gripping her waist, her blouse slipping from her shoulders. The green walls bore witness to it all, and the sound of laughter, a sound I thought I'd known intimately, became foreign and grotesque. I hated her in that moment, but worse, I hated myself. Hated that I couldn't look away, that some sick part of me was transfixed. My love for her tangled with revulsion in ways I didn't know were possible. When it ended, they straightened their clothes as if nothing had happened. The man left, and she sat at her desk, typing notes into her laptop, cool and composed, as if she hadn't just detonated our lives. I closed my laptop and sat in silence, the faint hum of the air conditioner filling the void. My mind churned through half-formed thoughts, none of them making sense. Had I driven her to this? Had I been blind to signs that were obvious in hindsight? But deeper than those questions was something worse, something I didn't want to admit even to myself. The video played on a loop in my head, haunting me not just with the betrayal, but with the dark, shameful thrill I felt watching it. For a week, I didn't say a word to her. Couldn't. Every time I saw her, all I could see was the green walls and the man's hand gripping her waist. She acted normal, oblivious to the fire burning behind my eyes. Her ease only enraged me further. Did she think I was stupid? Or had she done this so often that hiding it was second nature? I replayed the footage more times than I could count, trying to decode her expression, trying to see if there was guilt, regret. But there was nothing, just her. For 7 days, I carried the secret like a disease, infecting every thought, every breath. And each day, she went about her life as though nothing had happened. I knew I couldn't keep it inside forever. Something had to give. But for now, I waited, unsure if I was biding my time for the right moment, or if I was simply too scared to face her. That night, when she kissed me before bed, her lips lingering as though trying to coax warmth from my cold response, I felt nothing but the metallic taste of my own restraint. It began innocently enough, if such a word can describe the start of something that would later dismantle my entire life. I met her during one of her therapy sessions. Back then, I was desperate, not for love, but for answers. My marriage was falling apart, and I'd reluctantly sought help from a therapist who specialized in intimacy and sexual dysfunction. That's where she entered my life. Poised, intelligent, with a piercing confidence that disarmed me. She listened to my complaints with an almost surgical precision, dissecting my words and diagnosing the cracks in my first marriage. At first, I found her clinical detachment irritating, but over time it became magnetic. She had this way of speaking, this almost hypnotic rhythm, that made everything she said seem profound. I didn't notice the shift at first, the way I began looking forward to the sessions, not for therapy, but for her. Somewhere along the way, my feelings changed. She must have sensed it too, because her demeanor softened. What started as a strictly professional relationship began to blur, the unspoken tension between us thickening until one day, she hinted that perhaps my desire for her was natural, that maybe it wasn't something to suppress but to explore. The line between therapist and lover dissolved quickly after that. And it wasn't long before I made the worst decision of my life. I left my family for her. Winning her over hadn't been easy. Outside of the office, she was far more guarded. She resisted my first marriage proposal outright, claiming she wasn't ready for that level of commitment. But I was relentless, convinced that what we had was worth fighting for. I proposed a second time 6 months later, and though she accepted, I always felt her hesitance lingered, a shadow I chose to ignore. Our marriage was less a union of equals and more of a high-wire act. She was a complex woman, brilliant, but prone to dissecting everything, even the smallest arguments, with a clinical lens. I could never just feel angry or upset without her analyzing me, tying every emotion to some trauma or childhood wound. She was the center of my world, but to her, I always felt peripheral, one part of a larger narrative she controlled. And yet, I stayed, seduced by her intellect, by her raw charisma, and by a connection that burned bright even as it consumed me. I should have known it wouldn't last. Something built on fragile foundations always collapses eventually. I just didn't expect it to crumble so soon. The first signs of trouble came early, though I ignored them at the time. She had always been analytical, a trait I admired at first, but it began to weigh on me. Any disagreement or frustration I expressed was reduced to psychological jargon, my childhood ego wounds, as she'd call them. Nothing could just be. Everything had to be dissected and explained. She brought her work home in other ways, too. Her fascination with sex and relationships didn't stay confined to her office. She'd talk about her clients over dinner. Not by name, of course, but the details were vivid enough. It was as if every conversation circled back to her world, her field. She didn't seem to notice how detached I'd become, how much I hated hearing about her work after long days of my own. Then there was her growing secrecy. She worked late more often, brushing off my questions with a breezy, "You know how unpredictable this job is." When I pushed, she'd accuse me of being insecure or clingy, and I'd retreat, ashamed for even asking. Still, I clung to the good moments. She could be magnetic when she wanted to be, drawing me in with the same charm that had captivated me from the start. But those moments grew fewer and farther between. More and more, I felt like an outsider in my own marriage, desperately trying to hold on to something I was already losing. At the time, I didn't see these cracks for what they were. I thought they were normal struggles, the kind every marriage went through. But now, in hindsight, I can see them clearly. The early signs of a betrayal I hadn't yet dared to imagine. Her behavior shifted gradually, subtle enough that I didn't notice at first. She began staying late at the office more frequently, claiming her patients needed extra time, or that she had paperwork to catch up on. It seemed plausible. She was dedicated to her work. But the excuses started piling up. There were other things, too. The way she'd pull her phone close whenever a message came through, or how she started dressing differently for work. Sharper, more polished, as though she were preparing for something other than therapy sessions. When I asked about it, she brushed me off with a laugh, saying I was being paranoid. I tried to push the doubts away, telling myself I was imagining things. But then I overheard a call she didn't know I was listening to. Her voice was soft, intimate, the way she used to speak to me before the distance grew between us. She was laughing light, playful, something I hadn't heard from her in months. That was the moment the first real seed of suspicion took root. I didn't want to believe she could be unfaithful. I told myself it was stress, that the distance between us was just a phase. But no matter how hard I tried, the doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. It wasn't until I saw the man, a tall, well-dressed figure who walked into her office one evening as I was driving past, that my suspicions solidified. I didn't recognize him, but the way he glanced around before stepping inside made my stomach churn. I started watching her more closely after that. Patterns began to emerge, little inconsistencies in her stories, subtle shifts in her demeanor. The woman I thought I knew was slipping away, and I couldn't figure out if I was losing her, or if she was already gone. Well, as you know, I installed cameras in her office. I told myself it was for peace of mind, but really, it was desperation. I'd been ignoring my gut for too long, and the cameras felt like the only way to finally silence it, or confirm what I couldn't bring myself to say out loud. When the footage came in, it hit me like a train. The confirmation wasn't just devastating, it was addictive. I told myself I'd watch it once, just to know the truth. But I didn't stop there. The first time, I watched in disbelief, barely breathing. The second time, it was rage that consumed me, my fingers trembling as I replayed the footage. But by the third, a darker, more twisted reaction crept in. I hated myself for it, but there was something about watching it that I couldn't look away from. I started noticing things I hadn't caught the first time. The way she touched her hair, the way her laugh filled the room. I didn't know if I was trying to figure out what went wrong or just punishing myself, but every time I told myself, this is the last time, I'd click play again. It became a sick ritual. She'd leave for work, and I'd sit down at my laptop, cue up the footage, and watch. I hated her for what she did, but somehow, watching her betrayal made me feel closer to her, like I could reclaim some piece of her that I'd lost. The worst part was the shame. I knew how twisted it was, how pathetic I'd become. But no matter how many times I closed the laptop, the urge to reopen it came back stronger. The footage wasn't just proof of her betrayal, it was my obsession, my downfall. By the end of that week, I wasn't just angry anymore. I was unraveling. She didn't know it yet, but the man she came home to each night wasn't the same one she'd left that morning. I couldn't look at her without seeing flashes of the footage, couldn't hear her voice without replaying the laughter she'd shared with him. It wasn't just betrayal, it was contamination. Everything she did felt tainted. And yet, I still hadn't confronted her. The words sat on my tongue like poison, but every time I tried to say them, something held me back. Maybe it was fear of what I'd unleash, fear of what she might say. She must have noticed something was off. She'd grown cautious around me, her usual confidence laced with something almost nervous. She'd try to break the tension, making small talk at dinner, brushing my arm in the hallway. But I wasn't giving her anything. That's when she tried her other approach, the one she'd perfected in her profession. She came home one evening and, instead of her usual routine, sat down across from me at the kitchen table. She started talking, her tone calm, measured. It was that same voice she used with her patients, the one that was meant to soothe and coax the truth out of people. She said she'd noticed I'd been distant, asked if there was something I wanted to share. It was almost laughable, her trying to psychoanalyze me, sitting there with that calm, practiced face, acting like this was some mutual misunderstanding we could unpack together. My anger boiled over before I could stop it. I slammed my fist on the table, cutting her off mid-sentence. "I know everything," I said, my voice low but trembling with rage. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she froze, the practiced mask of calm slipping from her face. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard it, though she was trying to keep it even. "You know exactly what I mean," I said, standing up. "The cameras. Your office. Him." She opened her mouth to respond but stopped herself, her expression shifting rapidly from shock to fear to something almost calculating. For the first time, I saw her panic, but it wasn't guilt. It was self-preservation. "I can explain," she started, taking a step toward me, but I raised a hand, stopping her in her tracks. Don't insult me with an explanation." Her calm facade cracked then, fully and completely. She wasn't the composed professional anymore. She looked at me like a cornered animal, her voice stumbling as she tried to find words that might fix what couldn't be repaired. It's not what you think," she stammered, but even she didn't seem to believe it. I walked out before she could say anything else. I didn't trust myself to stay. If I did, I knew I'd say things I couldn't take back, do something that couldn't be undone. She didn't follow me. For once, she let me go. But as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I knew this wasn't over. She wasn't going to let this drop, and neither was I. The only question was who would break first. The night I left, I didn't take much. A suitcase, a few shirts, and my laptop. I didn't want anything from that house. Not the furniture we'd picked out together. Not the framed photos that mocked me from the walls. Every corner of that place reeked of her, of lies, of everything I thought we were. I rented a small apartment on the other side of town, just enough space to exist. It was cold and sterile, the opposite of the home we'd built. But in a way it was fitting. This place wasn't for living. It was for retreating, for licking my wounds. Sitting alone in the dark that first night, my thoughts were relentless. I replayed every moment of our relationship, trying to trace the cracks back to the beginning. That's when it hit me, like a cold slap to the face. She'd been manipulating me from the start. I thought back to the way she'd drawn me in, her calculated charm, how she always had the upper hand in every conversation, every argument. She'd been dissecting me like one of her patients all along, steering me, controlling me, breaking me down into pieces she could manage. And I'd let her. I'd worshipped her intellect, her sophistication, convincing myself that I was lucky to have her. I'd ignored every red flag, every instinct, because I thought she was above reproach. But now I saw her for what she really was. A manipulator, a predator. The realization churned in my gut, morphing my sadness into something darker. Anger.
No, Ray.
The kind that claws at your insides, that demands to be let out. She had destroyed me, not just with her betrayal but with everything she'd done leading up to it. She'd hollowed me out, made me question myself, made me feel weak, inadequate. And then, as if that weren't enough, she'd turned to someone else. I hated her. I hated how powerless she made me feel, how she'd taken everything I gave her and left me with nothing. Sitting in that empty apartment, surrounded by silence, I felt like the shell of a man I used to be. I needed her to pay. The thought came out of nowhere, sharp and insistent. I didn't know how or when, but I knew I couldn't let her walk away from this unscathed. She had to feel the way I felt, helpless, weak, ruined. But the anger couldn't hold back the flood of despair for long. It swept over me in waves, dragging me down. I sat there for hours, unmoving, the weight of everything she'd done pressing on my chest like a boulder. I wanted to scream. I wanted to smash something, to obliterate everything in sight. But all I could do was sit there, suffocating under the weight of my own failure. By the time the sun rose, my anger had taken root. It wasn't the kind of rage that explodes and burns out. It was quieter, colder. A deep, simmering hatred that wouldn't go away until I found a way to take back control. In the days that followed, my anger evolved into something more deliberate. It was no longer a chaotic storm threatening to consume me. It became focus, a cold, calculated resolve. If she had spent all this time manipulating me, controlling me, then I'd take that power back. She would pay for what she did to me. I started by researching. Late at night, with only the dull hum of my laptop to keep me company, I looked into the ethical codes and licensing rules for professionals in her field. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Relationships between therapists and their clients, or even former clients, were strictly forbidden. It wasn't just frowned upon. It was grounds for losing her license. The thought filled me with grim satisfaction. She'd built her whole identity around her career, around being the calm, intelligent guide for people whose lives had spiraled out of control. She loved the power it gave her, the way people revered her. Taking that away would be the ultimate blow. But it wasn't just about the career. It was about leveling the playing field. For years, I'd let her hold all the cards, let her psychoanalyze me into submission, make me doubt myself at every turn. Now it was my turn to hold the power, to make her feel as helpless and exposed as she'd made me. I wrote the complaint late one night, the words coming more easily than I expected. I detailed everything: the timeline of her betrayal, the proof I had from the cameras, the violation of her professional boundaries. I was careful, methodical, leaving no room for doubt. When I finished, I stared at the document for a long time, my finger hovering over the submit button. A small part of me hesitated. This wasn't just revenge, it was annihilation. If the complaint succeeded, it wouldn't just tarnish her reputation. It would destroy it, and with it, the life she'd built. But then I thought about the footage, about the way she'd smiled at him, the way she'd looked so at ease while dismantling my world. My hesitation evaporated, and I hit submit. The next morning, I woke up feeling strangely empty. I'd expected some sense of triumph, a moment of catharsis, but it didn't come. The anger was still there, simmering just below the surface, but it was joined by something else: doubt. What if this wasn't enough? What if ruining her career didn't fill the void she'd left in me? I tried to push the thoughts away, telling myself I'd done the right thing. She deserved this. She deserved worse. But no matter how many times I repeated it, the weight of my own actions lingered. I had taken the first step in making her pay, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just her life I was dismantling. It was my own. Less than a week after I filed the complaint, she called me. Her voice was sharp, controlled, but I could sense the panic underneath. She insisted we meet in person. At the cafe, she wasted no time. She accused me of being vindictive, of trying to destroy her career out of spite. Her calm facade was crumbling, though she tried to maintain it, shifting blame and insisting that what I'd done was hurting the people she helped. Her excuses only fueled my anger. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was scared of losing everything. When I called her out, her expression wavered, but only for a moment. Then she snapped back, threatening to fight back if I didn't drop the complaint. I stood, meeting her icy glare with resolve. "Everyone will know who you really are," I said, walking away. Her words stayed with me, though this wasn't over. But for once, I was ready for whatever came next. After our confrontation, she went silent, no doubt plotting her next move. I used the time to prepare, combing through old messages and documents, determined to strengthen my case. What I found only deepened my anger. Subtle manipulations I hadn't noticed before, ways she had controlled me from the beginning. Even her professional notes hinted at the affair, with vague references to a boundary-testing patient. It confirmed what I'd feared. She'd been breaking rules and betraying me long before I realized. I compiled everything: emails, notes, receipts. When I sent it to the board, I felt a cold, sharp satisfaction. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. I wanted to expose her, to make her feel the helplessness and humiliation she had inflicted on me. She had built her power on lies and control. Now it was time for it all to come crashing down. The day I received confirmation that her organization had opened an investigation, it felt like the first real victory I'd had in months. She'd always been the one in control, the one pulling strings and bending reality to suit her narrative. Now, for the first time, someone was holding her accountable. But it wasn't the clean triumph I'd imagined. My anger didn't disappear. If anything, it deepened as I thought about how much she had taken from me. Not just my trust, but my sense of self. For weeks, I lived in a state of tense anticipation, waiting for her to retaliate. When the retaliation finally came, it wasn't explosive, it was calculated. A lawyer's letter arrived at my door, dripping with accusations. Harassment, defamation, even invasion of privacy. I laughed when I read it. She was flailing, trying to spin her downfall into my fault. Her attempts to intimidate me only strengthened my resolve. I doubled down, reaching out to witnesses, gathering statements, ensuring the investigation against her was airtight. I wasn't going to back down. Not this time. The days dragged on, and the battle became more than just about her betrayal. It became about reclaiming my dignity. For so long, she'd made me feel small, weak, as if I should be grateful for her even as she dismantled me piece by piece. But I was done being the victim. When the final decision from the board came, I didn't celebrate. The letter was clinical and impersonal, but its implications were catastrophic for her. Suspension of her license, a public mark on her record, a career that was effectively over. It wasn't enough to erase what she'd done to me, but it was something. She tried to call me after the verdict, maybe to beg, maybe to rage, but I didn't answer. I had nothing left to say to her. I thought about how I'd spent years chasing her approval, trying to live up to the impossible standards she set. I'd convinced myself she was out of my league, that I needed to earn her love. But in the end, she'd been the one who wasn't worthy of me. There's a strange emptiness in revenge, though. I thought ruining her would make me whole again, but it didn't. I still felt hollow, haunted by the years I'd wasted, the person I'd become under her influence. The truth is, she wasn't just my wife. She was an addiction. The manipulation, the emotional highs and lows, the way she made me feel both small and significant. It was intoxicating, even as it destroyed me. Letting go of her wasn't just letting go of my marriage. It was letting go of the version of myself I'd built around her. For a long time, I sat with that emptiness, unsure of how to move forward. But emptiness can be freeing. Slowly, I started to rebuild. I focused on the relationships I'd neglected, on hobbies I'd abandoned. I spent time alone, learning to trust my instincts again, to see myself as more than just the wreckage she'd left behind. The anger has faded now, replaced by something quieter, acceptance. She took a lot from me, but she didn't take everything. In the end, I realized the greatest revenge wasn't ruining her life. It was reclaiming mine.